It really was something completely unfamiliar, and yet I felt I had to follow it. In the end, it saved both of our lives, because on my side there was no roof left, it was flattened. Even beforehand, I had had the feeling that something like a test was coming toward me.
Do you have any idea what kind of test that was? Why did it happen?
That moment of waking up was terrible for me too. The contrast between that warm, soft, loving light and this sterile, bright, glaring, completely dead light with no life in it at all. It was like a moment of shock. And that was actually my main preoccupation during that phase. I could not explain to myself how I could have forgotten something that was so constant, something that had always already been there and felt so right, and so much like being home.
Frau Prislin, Sie sind Heilpraktikerin für Psychotherapie.
Ms. Prislin, you're an alternative practitioner in psychotherapy, and you have had several experiences that would be described today as near-death experiences. Thank you for your willingness to share them. Based on what you told me before this conversation, I would like to proceed chronologically, starting with your early childhood. There were experiences that you now classify in retrospect as out-of-body experiences.
Yes, that is exactly how I would put it.
What did you experience back then?
That was in my early childhood. I must have been between 2 and 3 years old. A lot of it I only know from what my parents told me. But apparently, I had a habit of screaming myself into real rage. I'd have these very intense screaming fits. And because of that, I often had a kind of diaphragmatic spasm. Then suddenly, I could not breathe anymore and I would faint. I no longer remember exactly what led to it, but I remember very well this feeling when my diaphragm suddenly seemed to lock, how my breathing would stop and just no longer work. And in that moment, you actually know, taking a breath would be good now, but nothing happens. I still remember the panic that rises up quite well. But afterward, I remember a very pleasant, liberated feeling. And of course, I also know from my parents that they would always come, especially that my mother would always come running very quickly. But I also had it visually in my mind. I can remember always seeing everything from a rather elevated position, how she came running up, and then sometimes seeing from above how one person, or sometimes several people, depending on who happened to be standing around me, bent over me. I remember that view from above very well, and this pleasant feeling. I thought of the whole subject of fainting and screaming fits very positively, because I connected it with this pleasant feeling.
You thought, okay, then I'll scream again.
Yes, something like that. I do not know whether I did it consciously. I mainly know it from what my parents told me. But even so, I remember it very positively. That feeling of looking down from above, it all had such peace and relaxation. And then I still remember how it felt when I suddenly was back down below. And I thought, this doesn't feel especially nice. This switch from above to below, back into the body, and then looking up from below into the faces above me, I did not like that very much. So I have these memories stored more on an emotional level.
And what feelings did you have during that time? Security, weightlessness? Exactly.
It was such a protected, warm, soft and free feeling. It felt very relaxed and calm. I always saw my mother coming, and from a particular perspective. She came around the corner. I remember that she came down a staircase where it turned a corner, and from my perspective, I could not have seen her running up. And yet, I still remember seeing her run. And I could not understand that frantic urgency at all.
But you could also sense the hustle and bustle.
I could perceive the urgency, and I noticed that my mother was very agitated. But for myself, I did not perceive the situation as having any real danger because I thought, I'm actually fine. I felt very comfortable there. It was such a soft and pleasant feeling. But then not anymore once I was back down below.
Was it a special experience of returning, or was it just suddenly different and you were back down again?
Yes, it was from one moment to the next. I still remember that it was very strange. I thought, but I was just up there. So that very abrupt change from above, where I was fine, to below, where suddenly I was there and everyone was looking at me, was not so pleasant. I was not actually unwell afterwards. There were only fainting spells.
And coming back was then simultaneously waking up, right?
Yes, exactly. It meant being back in the body and in the proper perspective again.
And also wake up from unconsciousness.
Exactly, waking up from unconsciousness.
How did your parents experience that? Must have been terrible for them.
I spoke with my mother about it again recently, and she says it was terrible for her back then. Once she even carried me over to the hospital because the problem was that I apparently often had these screaming fits on a staircase. So it must have at least been at an age where I could climb stairs by myself. And she could always tell from the way I was crying, oh my God, it's about to happen again. She's going to collapse on me again. Then she would always come running. And for her, it was a total nightmare. Just hearing that I was somewhere where I might fall down was awful for her. It was very distressing. And once she was already on her way with me, back then we had a hospital just across the street from us. So she was already on her way to the hospital with me, and then I woke up again. So those were not pleasant experiences for her.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Die innere Stimme hat sich im Lauf des Lebens für Sie
Over the course of your life, your inner voice has often served as an important guide for you. For example, during your youth, when your beloved grandfather fell ill.
erkrankt ist.
That's also a very interesting story. Please tell us what happened back then.
At the time, he actually only had the flu. From the outside, nothing that looked threatening. But throughout his illness, I already had a very strange feeling, and I was very worried, even though outwardly nothing suggested that it was anything dangerous. One evening, my mother, who lived in the same town, and she had been going over to check on him and looked after him, that evening they spoke on the phone, and my mother wanted to ask again whether he needed anything, whether she should stop by again. And he said no, everything was fine, he was going to sleep, and he didn't need her anymore that day. I overheard that, and inside I had a very strong feeling that it was now extremely important for her to go and check on him again. I begged her insistently to drive over and see whether everything was all right. Thank God she did. And the moment she arrived, he had already vomited blood because he had a very sensitive stomach and could not tolerate various medications. Evidently, these were medications that had triggered severe stomach bleeding for him. He was already in a condition where he no longer would have been able to actively get help for himself. My mother, of course, immediately made sure he was taken to the hospital. He even had emergency surgery that night. The doctor said that he probably would not have survived if it had not all happened so quickly.
So this premonition was very important.
It was very important to me. To him too, of course, but also to me.
Another premonition, which you only became aware of after the event, concerned a serious car accident. You had this accident when you were 21 with your boyfriend at the time in southern Italy.
I'd like to give you a bit more context. The backstory was that I had always gone to this campsite in southern Italy with my parents, and I had driven down that route many times. A circle of friends had formed that every year went there at the same time. We continued that tradition, and even as adults, we still met there every year. That route, and this is why it matters, was one I had already driven many, many times before. I had never had any great concerns that such a long car journey, which we always drove in one stretch, would be a problem. Back then, my boyfriend and I had driven down there, and the trip was completely fine. I had no concerns at all, but we had agreed that we would drive back a few days earlier because he still wanted to move house. At the time, We agreed on that. It was fine. But during the holiday, I noticed that the closer the departure day came, the heavier I felt inside. I became sad and I did not want to go. There was a real resistance there, but I could not really interpret it. It seemed so disproportionate, given that we were simply going to cut the trip short by a few days. And on the day of departure, I was already totally nervous inside. I've been thinking about how best to describe the feeling. The closest comparison is probably a test you have ahead of you, like a final school exam, where you know you really do not want to go, but you have to, because somehow life has to continue. We wanted to leave in the early evening. We had one more meal, and by then I could not get anything down. I was already feeling really nauseous. I was simply agitated. Then when we said goodbye, and while saying goodbye in the circle of friends and my parents, I burst into tears. At the same time, I felt it was completely disproportionate that I was reacting so strongly just because we were leaving a few days early. In the car, I managed to calm down a little, but I had the very forceful thought that it was now extremely important for me to sleep immediately, even though it was still very early evening. I felt I had to be rested later when we changed drivers. And that was a thought I had never once had before on that route.
But you did trust him to drive well.
Absolutely. It had not been a problem at all on the way there. And those thoughts simply had not been there. But because of this strange feeling and the thought, you have to be rested now so that things go well later when you change drivers and so that you're awake enough, which had never been an issue before, because on these long car journeys, I had never felt that I was tired or should have gone to sleep earlier. It really was something completely unfamiliar. And yet, I felt I had to follow it. So, even though we had started at around 7 or 7:30 in the evening, quite soon afterward, I put a pillow against the side of my head and settled back between the window and the seat. I thought, well, you can't sleep anyway, but at least try. And strangely, it felt as if a bell were lowering itself over me, slightly dampening my sensory perceptions, the noises, as well as everything coming from the outside. Then I actually managed to fall asleep, really deeply asleep. But I know that 2 or 3 times in between I startled awake because I had the feeling, what was that just now? A bump or something? Each time I looked at the speedometer next to me to see how fast he was driving because I thought, oh please, is he going too fast? And then I saw, no, completely normal, 120, 130, a normal cruising speed. And each time I had this fixed thought again, everything is okay. Now just trust him and sleep. So it was always the same pattern. Then I felt the bell come down over me again, and I was gone, really gone. And the accident we actually had, it happened around midnight, so we had not even been on the road that long. I slept right through it. That was my good fortune. We somehow became airborne, and to this day it has not been fully explained. My boyfriend at the time had probably fallen asleep also. Somehow we must have driven over something that made the car lift off like that. We were really in the air. The car turned over once, and we hit the crash barrier between the 2 lanes roof first. Then we slid back down, and thank God came to rest upside down on our side of the road, meaning on the correct side of the motorway. The crash barrier had practically folded our car like a tin can. But thank God it did not go straight through the car. In that case, the roof would practically have been gone. Instead, it went diagonally. It went from the passenger side, where I had been sitting, diagonally backward behind the driver's side. That means that in the end, it saved both of our heads. On my side, there was actually no roof left. Not straight back from the hood, but thank God diagonally. So the one place where my head was lying remained free. There was still a slight raised area there where my head had space, practically unharmed. Otherwise, I think my entire upper body would have been crushed.
There's also a dramatic souvenir photo of what the car looked like afterwards.
Yes, exactly. My parents were notified too. And this also felt as if it had been guided. The accident happened directly in front of an exit. And beyond that exit, there was an excellently equipped hospital. At that time in Italy, the standard was not yet so high, but they had everything there that I would have needed, at least for the preliminary examinations. MRI, CT, they had everything on site.
And your friend survived too?
Yes, he suffered fewer injuries. The good fortune was that the impact went through the car at such an angle that the roof on his driver's side remained intact. And he must have been sitting much more upright in the car.
Did the experience change your worldview in any way? In the sense that you realized, I did have a premonition of some kind, or fortunately I felt guided in such a way that nothing worse happened?
I was actually aware of it in that moment. I do not know whether I was unconscious. I had been asleep and I cannot remember the actual process of the accident. But the first conscious thought I had in the car was, now we have finally got it behind us. It was immediately clear to me. I had known it the whole time. I knew it had to happen. And that now we had finally gotten it behind us.
It was, so to speak, a matter of fate.
Exactly. It was somehow already programmed into my system. Even beforehand, I had practically had the feeling, like with a test, I have to go through this now. I do not want to, but I have to go through it.
Do you have any idea what kind of test that was? Why did it happen?
Just trust now. On the one hand, there was the trust in this inner voice, which was actually untypical for me, that I followed it and got through by going to sleep and resting my head to the side.
Indem ich jetzt dieser Stimme nachgebe und mich schlafen lege und meinen Kopf auf die Seite bette.
And then there was also these repeated moments of irritation in between, when I startled awake, and then that inner voice came again. Trust him. Just trust now. It's okay. Lie back down and sleep. I think in retrospect that is something quite valuable for me in certain life situations. When I wonder how something is going to turn out, I remember how I was guided through that accident and think, I've already once been steered through something, and I can rely on somehow being guided through this too.
So learning to trust one's inner voice, or learning to trust in general, was a topic.
That was absolutely a theme, and largely still is today.
Im Jahr 2000 ist Ihre Großmutter verstorben.
Your grandmother passed away in 2000, and around the time of her death, you had another experience that stayed with you for decades.
Yes, that was not a very pleasant experience. At the time, I found it very irritating and disturbing. It was the sudden death of my grandmother, who died very unexpectedly from one moment to the next. It was the first night after I had found out about it. And I had gone to my parents' home to be there for the funeral.
Und habe da natürlich aufgrund dieses Schocks und der Trauer, in der ich mich da befunden habe, auch
because of the shock and the grief, I could not sleep. I still wanted to rest a little, so I was lying in bed. It was dark. My eyes were closed, and I'm completely sure I was not asleep. Instead, I somehow felt as if the room had suddenly lost its dimensions. Normally, when you lie in bed with your eyes closed and it's dark, you still have a bodily sense of the room and can locate everything. All of that just collapsed. It was as if I fell into an emptiness or a void. It was very dark and very cold, and I was totally disoriented. At the same time, from everywhere, I heard very forceful sounds and demanding voices, talking at me from all sides. But I could not understand them. It was as if they were coming through a voice distorter, completely distorted and warped, or like when you try to speak underwater, those strange distorted sounds. That is how it came across. But they were very forceful and kept talking at me. Physically, too. I had the feeling that they were crowding me, pulling and tugging at me. That disturbed and frightened me incredibly. And I started striking out around me. I said something along the lines of, "Enough now. If you want something from me, then only one of you should speak, and in a way I can understand. And how do I get out of here?" I no longer remember exactly what I said, but that was the gist of it. And then what amazed me, including its forcefulness, was that suddenly there was silence. It stopped, and there was a brief moment, like a freeze, when nothing was there anymore. Then, very clearly and distinctly, a male voice came. I did not see or perceive anyone, but suddenly there was this male voice that said, very clearly and distinctly, "You must go barefoot into the chamber of insight." That really unsettled me. I asked, "Where is this chamber? How do I get there?" And the only answer I got was, "I can't tell you that either. And even if I would, it wouldn't matter because you're still wearing shoes." And then, whoosh, I was back in my bed and in my room. I was completely agitated and disturbed. I immediately turned on the light, and I could not turn it off again all night. And for the nights after that too. Although I was already in my mid-20s, I think I couldn't sleep in the dark for a week or so. It really disturbed me.
So it had a completely different intensity than a normal dream,
Yes, completely different.
even than a nightmare.
Yes. It was so intense, so clear, and so physically palpable. The atmosphere, too. It was so very... I've had nightmares in my life. But for me, they're usually gone the moment I wake up. Of course, I feel a little shaken, but this had a completely different intensity. It was literally another dimension.
Did you have, and do you still remember the feeling of having experienced reality?
Yes. It was completely clear, even though I did not see anything. There was only darkness, nothing physical or otherwise perceptible, nothing visually perceptible. But it was so clear and so retroactively real that today I would swear it was not a dream, that it had some other kind of dimensionality into which I slipped.
And did you associate this experience in any way, apart from the temporal connection, with your grandmother's death? Was there a connection?
I think so, because I was also very close to my grandmother. Perhaps something opened inwardly for another realm, but not to a nicer dimension as one might wish, but presumably to an intermediate realm. Today, after having dealt with this subject for many years, and after having listened to and watched many near-death reports, I would say that as an inner truth for me, I now understand it somewhat as a dimension where perhaps deceased people stay who have not yet fully realized that they have died, or who are perhaps not ready to move forward in their development. Instead, there is a great deal of confusion and fear there, and probably also disorientation, I experienced everything there as very disorienting. I had the feeling that they wanted something from me, or wanted to cling or attach themselves to me somehow. Perhaps in the hope that I would tell them how things continue, or that I would get them out of there. Because that was also the dominant feeling I had, that one does not want to be there, that it is very confusing and frightening, and that one wants to get away again.
And this image of leaving one's shoes behind and walking barefoot could also have to do with shedding the earthly realm entirely, so to speak.
Exactly. That's how I interpreted it for myself. At first, I didn't understand it. But I did notice, also through other near-death experience reports in which people said they perceived the deceased in the afterlife as barefoot and often dressed in white. It's through that I understood it for myself as a metaphor and experienced it in that way. People often say that when you die, you shed your coat, as if taking something off and then continuing with the essence. And this message, that it would not matter because I still had shoes on, felt to me like a message saying, well, you're still alive. You've not yet shed this physical existence. So the chamber of insight is of no use to you. You cannot go into it at the moment anyway. That's how I interpreted the whole thing for myself.
Could it perhaps simply have been an empathetic experience of a situation in which other souls find themselves? Because according to what you said, it could also have to do with this spontaneous transition, with the unpreparedness, where this letting go simply still needs to take place.
Yes, exactly. I actually considered that too. Whether it was connected with my grandmother's sudden death, that she might perhaps also have been confused and still in such an intermediate realm. Perhaps she was even among the voices. And perhaps the statement I received also helped her, hopefully, so that she then knew, okay, perhaps this is where the path continues.
But you had no after-death contact with your grandmother following her death, did you?
No, I did not.
According to you, your most traumatic but also most beautiful experience was in 2005.
Yes, that was during my first pregnancy. Medically, it turned out afterward that toward the end of the 4th month, I had developed a bacterial infection in the uterus. Without any warning signs and without having been foreseeable. It really happened from one moment to the next. One Sunday morning, I woke up with severe lower abdominal pain. Because the pain escalated so quickly, my husband took me to the hospital, to the emergency room. My bad luck, of course, was that no one was immediately available, because apparently an emergency surgery was already taking place, and the senior doctor was already involved in that emergency. My water had already broken in the car, so everything was progressing very, very quickly. In that moment, it was already clear to me that I was going to lose the baby. There was no stopping it. None of it felt good. But I was first examined by a very young resident doctor. With the ultrasound, she could still see that the child was alive. The heart was beating, it was still moving. She also tried to calm me down and said that sometimes a little fluid can leak and everything can regenerate. She said it was not so dramatic. But I knew this feels different. At that moment, however, they couldn't do anything for me. So they put me in a side room where I was supposed to wait until the senior doctor came at some point and the lab results were available. But that did not work out, because I noticed that everything was moving in a completely uncontrolled direction, and the pain was becoming exorbitant. Compared with the births I later had with my 2 daughters, I now know what contractions feel like. Back then I did not know yet, but looking back in comparison, these were not just normal contractions. They were intensified, and that was probably because the infection added another dimension of pain. Then heavy bleeding started and still no one came. I just noticed that everything was literally going down the drain and I was completely helpless and at the mercy of the situation. From a certain point on, I only had the urgent need for the pain to stop and for me somehow to get out of that situation. They could have done anything to me, and I could no longer even think about the child. It did not matter. The main thing was that it would stop. Then, right on cue, a kind of birth process began. I felt something inside me releasing in waves and moving downward. And then I realized, okay, someone has to come now. Thank God my husband had gone out to try and get someone. That resident doctor came, got an overview of the situation, and said she would take care of it. Then, thank God, the senior doctor came quickly too. After the blood values also showed very high inflammation markers, she said, okay, then we definitely have to operate immediately. That was all fine with me. I thought, I just want out of this unbearable situation. I was so looking forward to that off switch, because from the accident and everything beforehand, I already knew, okay, anesthesia means the situation is over for the moment. And then you wake up, what feels like 1 second later. Not everything is good yet, but the worst is over. That was all I longed for. And then I did get that off switch in the operating room. But it was not the nothingness I had expected. Instead, I was immediately in an incredibly beautiful, warm, soft, enveloping, protected light, which I would describe as golden. It was also threaded through with many glittering golden elements that moved. This glittering and undulating was like pure life, vitality, and vibrancy. It was simply an energy. It was incredible. And it also carried the feeling, everything is good right now. It was this feeling, the way people often try to describe it, but words often fail, of being home, being sheltered, being loved, being accepted. All of that was there. At the same time, I perceived a presence beside me, although I did not see it. Everything I perceived there was more emotional. But this presence was always at my side. I knew it had always been there. It was like a blind understanding. We know each other. It knows me. I know it. And it had always been that way. It had this enduring quality that went beyond time. There was no need for words or exchange. It was simply there. And it was a yes. Everything is perfect and good right now. Everything is right. Everything feels right. And that was the complete opposite of what I had experienced before in that extreme situation. For me, it was simply a breathing out, a being home and having arrived. Then suddenly a thought popped up. How could I have forgotten this? Although in that moment, and this sounds paradoxical, I could not remember at all where I had just come from. I did not have the memory, I am Heidi, I am in emergency surgery, I am currently undergoing a severe traumatic miscarriage. I only had the feeling that I had temporarily forgotten the most familiar experience there is. All I knew was, yes, there was some kind of interlude, and that is why I did not remember just now. But how can that be? How can I not have remembered something so essential? And that was actually my main preoccupation during the whole phase. I could not take it in at all. I could not understand at all that I could have forgotten something that was so constant, had always been there, and felt so right and so much like home.
How could I ever have forgotten that?
Yes, how could I have forgotten that? Surely it's impossible to forget something like that.
So for you, that was somehow the real reality, the actual truth.
Yes, and in that moment it was so clear. That is why I struggled so much with the fact that I could have forgotten it. I simply could not understand that one could forget something like that.
And did the memory remain afterward?
Yes. Now I remember it. In terms of feeling, it at least remained very present and comforting during the first days after the surgery in the hospital. And the moment of waking up was terrible for me. Of course, I came to again in the recovery room. And then the light, that sudden contrast from this warm, soft, loving light into this sterile, bright, glaring, completely dead light with no life in it at all. It was like a shock in that moment. I kept remembering that golden light. I closed my eyes and tried to be drawn back into the light. And a few times I was able to make that shift again, so that I was briefly back in the light, but it became shorter and shorter. And then, of course, at some point, I was in that recovery room and actually thought, this does not feel good for me here. I did not want to be back.
Did this feeling of being at home, of security, have a similar quality to what you had experienced as a child?
Yes. Looking back now, when I remember it, it was like that. I do not have that golden light stored as vividly with the memories of those fainting spells. But the feeling I had was pretty much the same. It simply had this quality: everything is good right now. I feel sheltered. I feel cared for. I feel held. There was something very unburdened about the whole thing. It was very similar.
Was the feeling that everything is good right now, in this moment, just as it is? Or did the feeling go so far as to say, everything is good in general, all of life, everything I experience, even the unpleasant things, is ultimately good? Was that somewhat
Yes.
related?
Now that you put it that way, I think it really did have this all-encompassing quality.
Because that's also something that near-death experiencers report sometimes.
Yes. Although as a child, I did not understand why what I was seeing was so dramatic.
But the feeling was exactly that. Everything is good.
Yes, everything is good. I absolutely had the feeling that everything was all right. But in the operating room experience, it was the case that I did not really have that previous existence, that human existence present to me. It was like I've just come from somewhere that I'd forgotten. But that is actually not important. It really had something insignificant about it. So much so that I do not think I could even make that conscious connection in the moment.
What long-term effect would you say this experience had on you? How did it all influence you? Did it have an impact?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, at first not in an entirely positive way. Especially because of that last experience in 2005. Although in the first days in the hospital, I was still so protected within that emotional state, afterward, a kind of downward spiral began. That was because it had been a very traumatic experience, but I was not aware of that at the time. I tried to sort everything out very rationally. Well, it was just not meant to be. That's just how it went. It happens to many women. The traumatic experience and the experience of loss were given no space at all. And grief did not take place in me either. In retrospect, that set post-traumatic symptoms in motion. But I did not understand them. For me, everything simply became very frightening. Over the years, I initially lost my basic trust completely. There was a lot of anxiety, depressive phases, feelings of being overwhelmed, exhaustion, the whole 9 yards. In a sense, I then took the hard road through self-discovery. I could have understood, accepted, and integrated all these experiences right away. But that was not possible either, because I'm a very rationally wired person. I always wanted to arrange everything with my intellect and tended to dismiss all of it. I made life somewhat difficult for myself by not being able to accept many things or integrate them the way I can now. That brought with it a very hard path. From rock bottom, where I eventually found myself, I had to try to set out on the path back to myself. That also had to do with remembering. Perhaps because I also believed that this may have been the main content of my near-death experience. Returning to oneself, literally going inward and then looking at who I am, where I come from, and what all of this means for me. Creating a new definition of life, of death, of other dimensions, and allowing all of that to be, even when the intellect cannot understand it.
Was there any particular impulses that led you to move away from rational explanations and trust this memory? Or was it a gradual development that simply occurred because the other path led nowhere?
Yes, the other path was simply a dead end. There was no way forward. I was fortunate. My children's pediatrician, whom I was seeing at the time because everything with the children had once again become so exhausting, she looked at me and asked, "How are you, actually?" And then, in her consulting room, all the floodgates broke open. I realized that I had reached the point where things could not go on like this. She then said, "Now we will look at the whole thing systemically." She sent me to a constellation session, and in that first constellation session, the subject of the near-death experience came up. That was where it first emerged. From there, it was gradually allowed to develop and build, because only then could I engage with the subject in the way I can now. I then became deeply involved with the subject of near-death experiences, and even today, I'm still very, almost obsessively preoccupied with it, because it simply does me good. I also learn a great deal from other people's experiences, and I can accept them more easily because I've had this experience myself. That feeling that everyone always tries to describe and cannot really put into words, I can feel it. And that, of course, makes it easier for me to accept it and actually include these other realities within my own reality.
You wrote me a kind of summary of your journey before this interview. Quote, "Today I'm firmly convinced that we define death incorrectly, and that we should actually be looking forward to it, if we could remember what it feels like there, and what being at home really means. I believe that our deepest longings here are actually just a faint inkling of what we have forgotten, and that our soul actually wants to remember who we really are and where we originally come from."
That really sums it up beautifully. Now I have goosebumps.
I think that's a nice closing remark. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you.